While hiking in Colorado in 1893, Catherine Lee Bates, the daughter of a congregational pastor, wrote down a 4-verse poem. She was overwhelmed with the scenery she found in the West and wanted to write something that encaptured how she was feeling. It went on to be published in many local newspapers and quickly became popular. So much so that on November 11th, 1918, a battalion of the 26th Infantry Division of the United States Army sang her poem once they heard of the armistice of the First World War. Her poem, America the Beautiful, has since become an unofficial national anthem and a song that most, if not all, Americans know the words to. But do all Americans know of Catherine Coleman? Catherine Coleman was among the group of Wellesley College faculty hiking Pikes Peak that day, and Bates's partner of 25 years. Now, scholars have speculated on the relationship for decades, with some suggesting that they were just really good friends who entered into a platonic partnership known as a Boston marriage for financial independence. And while this is not completely out of the realm of possibility, their love for each other suggests otherwise. When Coleman was dying of breast cancer, Bates kept diary entries of her condition, surgeries, and details about her pain. In Coleman's final days, the women recited poetry and Bible verses to each other. And Bates wrote a memorial to Coleman that was only to be shared privately. After Coleman died, Bates said, "So much of me died with Catherine Coleman that I'm sometimes not quite sure whether I'm alive or not." She then went on to write Yellow Clover, a remembrance of love, in 1922 for Coleman. Catherine Lee Bates never entered into another relationship and lived in the home she shared with Coleman until her death in 1929. I may not have a PhD, but I do know queer love when I see it. Queer love and history, such as the relationship between Catherine Lee Bates and Catherine Coleman, are often hidden away with the hopes of never having to discuss it. For queer historians such as myself, that makes our jobs incredibly hard. Living in the South is just an added level of difficulty. I came out of the closet when I was just 13 years old and living in Corpus Christi, Texas in 2014. My parents responded incredibly with the knee-jerk reaction of asserting their love and support for me no matter what. My mom began buying me anything and everything with a rainbow on it, and when I asked why, she said, "Because you're gay, Madeline." As if this was something I had just found out. My dad made sure I knew about Lou Reed, Patti Smith, and The Clash. And in return, I made sure he knew about Harry Styles and Trixie Mattel. And they both completed possibly the hardest part of being the parents of a queer teenager, keeping up with all the gay drama. I can distinctly remember my parents watching a fast-paced conversation about the latest irritation in mine and my friends' high school lives like it was a game of tennis. Every year, they go to pride festivals and parades, sometimes without me, and give out free mom and dad hugs to anyone who wants one. They were, and still are, rock stars. Not even a year after I came out to my family, same-sex marriage became the law of the land. I remember waking up that morning to a phone full of texts and images coming from the steps of the Supreme Court. History was being made in my very short life, but I knew it couldn't have been a fight that was won overnight. And yet I was never taught the queer history that helped us get to that point. So I sought it out and became a queer historian at the ripe age of 14. When I moved to New Braunfels, Texas at 15, I continued my studies, and at 16, I started my high school's first ever gay-straight alliance. I taught other students queer history, and with the help of my advisor, created a safe space for students who needed it the most. Within the 2 years that I ran GSA, our membership went from 7 people to over 50 students, faculty, and staff who attended our after-school meetings regularly. Nearly 4 years after my graduation, they still meet and create community and share all the gay drama. At the beginning of the pandemic, when we were all stuck in our homes and all the Pride events were being shut down, I started putting my knowledge of queer history out into the world. For the entirety of the month of June, I typed out a different queer person of the day on my Instagram stories to educate people I knew about something I loved so dearly. I did it again for June 2021, but quickly realized I wanted to do more than just a handful of Instagram posts for 1 month out of the year. So after years of research, work, and sleepless nights, I launched my own queer education organization called the Queer Agenda. Men, women, and friends beyond the binary of all different ages, backgrounds, and even countries come to the Queer Agenda to learn. I talk about the trans women of color who threw bricks and turned a month into a celebration of queer life. I talk about the massive amounts of people we lost during the AIDS crisis and how our community rallied to save as many as we could. I talk about immigration laws, mental health, bathroom bills, and lavender languages. My job is to fill in the gaps left by traditional social studies curricula and pass on stories from the past to the next generation. And I love it. But by far, one of the most common questions I get asked about my work is why? Why queer history and why education? And for me, the answer is really quite simple. According to the Trevor Project, it is estimated that 1.8 million LGBTQ youth aged 13 to 24 will consider suicide each year in the United States, and at least one attempts suicide every 45 seconds. Being a teenager is hard. Being a queer teenager is an entirely different ballgame. When you are that young, it is so easy to feel disconnected from your community, especially when the governing body has made it virtually impossible to live quietly and without fear. When you are that young, you think you are the only person who has ever felt the way you're feeling. But queer history tells us otherwise. Queer history lays out millennia of coming out stories and feelings of disconnect and fear at our feet and says, see, you've never been alone. Queer history shows our family existing in places like the hollers of Appalachia, the cityscapes of San Francisco and New York, the small towns in the rural Midwest, the farmlands of the South, and still finding joy. That joy propelled their work as they fought to make the world a safer place for generations they never got to meet. It's hard not to get emotional about the idea of a complete stranger loving you and working so fiercely for you to live your best, most authentic life when you weren't even born. And yet, what a beautiful thing it is to know you've been loved for generations. Imagine how powerful that might be for anyone, let alone someone just starting to figure out who they are and how they fit into the world. Imagine the things you could do knowing of that love. So why are there only 5 states that require schools to teach this integral queer history? There's certainly not a lack of people who need to hear about it. According to a 2022 Gallup poll, more than 1 in 5 Gen Z identify as LGBTQ. That's 21% of the population born between 1997 and 2012. Many of the people born in my generation have been living on the heels of change for our entire lives. Coming into a post-9/11 world surrounded by housing crises, the rise of the internet, war, civil unrest, pandemics, and so much more. The playing field has changed. Why shouldn't our curriculum follow? The queer people who came before us were doctors, lawyers, activists, parents, educators, and priests. Queer people have existed since the dawn of time, and we have existed loudly. Denying to teach our youth queer history not only disconnects them from the community and isolates them further, but it can also be dangerous. Queer youth who are unable to identify their schools as an affirming space for them often have higher rates of suicidal ideation. Everyone deserves to see themselves represented in the classroom, and everyone deserves to feel like their peers have a basic understanding of where they're coming from. I will never be able to tell you what it feels like to be taught my own history in a classroom, and I cannot tell you when I think that will happen. But I can tell you how beautiful and affirming it is. Queer history is a history of color and resilience and love. A love that will both loudly sing along to an ABBA song with you and catch you when you fall. A love that anyone, queer or an ally, can identify with. It's a history of chosen families like mine whose care goes way beyond scorching June nights and making sure you don't embarrass yourself doing karaoke. It's a history of protest and revolution. It's a history that endures because we have come too far and worked too hard to let it all go to waste. Sappho once wrote, "Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time." We are living proof of that time. This talk is living proof of that time. Queer history is not just my history, but the history of the world. It is not exclusive or discriminative, but all-encompassing and uplifting. When people tell me they're interested in learning queer history, I obviously point them in different directions depending on what they want to know. The great thing about studying queer history for most of your young adult life is that you can talk about anything, from the iconic Hillary Duff commercial of the late 2000s to how colonization created gender binaries. But by far the most important thing I tell people to be aware of when they're learning queer history is how it makes them feel. A lot of it can make you sad and really, really angry. But it can also fill you with love and hope and a special kind of kinship. After so many years and so many people asking me how queer history makes me feel, I think I finally have an answer. Queer history to me feels like coming home. A home with lavender in the gardens and rainbows everywhere, because your mom keeps buying them for you, and it would be rude not to put them up. A home filled with records of the Velvet Underground, Les Tigres, Jane County, and of course, Harry Styles. A home with faded pictures on the wall of people you've never met, but you swear you know them. And maybe in another time you did. But the most important thing is that it's a safe home, filled with your favorite people in it. There's cookies on the counter, and your favorite show is on TV, and there's no rules except no Tarantino after 9 p.m., and it's beautiful, and messy, and queer. And the only thing you have to do to experience it is let yourself fall, and know that there will be people and history there to catch you. They've always been there. You just haven't gotten to properly meet them yet. Thank you.